Good morning. It's good to see all of you again this week. If you weren't here last week, or if you forgot, my name's Dave Finkbeiner. I'm a friend and colleague with Mike Van Lanningham, who I believe is out of town again this week. And so I've had the privilege of speaking this week and last week to you, and I thought I'd do a 2-week series on the book of Proverbs, particularly Proverbs 30. And as we saw last week, Proverbs 30 is not written by Solomon, but by a man named Agur. And we don't know much about Agur. It appears that he may, in fact, be a Gentile wise man who's a follower of the Lord. And so last week, I pointed out that Proverbs 30 can be really divided into 2 sections. Verses 1 through 9 is the prologue, what I called wisdom's attitude, which we talked about last week. And this week, we're going to be jumping into the rest of the chapter. But before we do, let me open with a word of prayer. Father, thank you for your word and for the fact that in it we find wisdom. Wisdom that only comes from you. Wisdom that we cannot achieve on our own. And wisdom that we need your help and your help alone to implement in our lives. And so, Lord, as we consider the lessons that we learned from this varied section of Scripture today, give us a heart that seeks for wisdom because we love you and we want to glorify you in how we live and trust you in bringing it about. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I'm not much of a shopper. My stepmother is like the quintessential shopper. She can find deals that are like, how did you do that? You know people like that? Maybe you're like that. You should give me some pointers. I'm not much of a shopper, but I do know enough about shopping to know that there is, at least for me, 2 basic kinds of shopping. There's what I call, first of all, the item shopping. This is when I look for one specific thing. I need to buy this thing, and I do research, and I look around and try to find the best deal and the best thing I can. My daughter is with me this morning, Emily, and a while ago, she wanted to get a very nice video camera, so still camera. So she did the research to find just the right digital camera. And once she found what she wanted, she came to me, and I did the research to find, okay, what's the best price I can find? And that's item shopping. And again, I'm not very good at it. I made some mistakes and didn't quite the deal that I should have. But hey, you learn. So there's item shopping. And then the other kind is what I do all the time, grocery shopping. And grocery shopping is what? Where you're not looking for one item, you're just looking for a list and fill it out. Now, the reason I bring that up is because just a little bit about sermon preparation. I learned in seminary and have learned, though I don't always implement it like I should, that the best kind of sermon is a little bit like item shopping. That is, it's to have one focused big idea. That if people miss half of what you're saying, they at least get the big idea when they walk away. And that works really well most of the time, until you come across a passage like the one I'm dealing with today. Last week, we looked at the prologue, which was a fairly focused section, what I called wisdom's attitude. And there, Agur told us, let me tell you, if you want to be wise, this is what you need to do. Give up any self-reliance and put your faith and hope in the God from whom wisdom comes. Trust in God, not in yourself, if you're going to be wise. And that was pretty straightforward. Well, the second half of Proverbs 30, verses 10 through 33, we just get a whole litany of different kinds of proverbs from Agur, covering all sorts of different things. And I'm trying to put it into one sermon. So it's a little bit like a grocery list than an item shopping. We're going to be looking at lots of different things. I'm kind of wrapping it around this way, though. I've called today's sermon Wisdom's Gallery, kind of like an art gallery. Because what we find as we look at these different proverbs is we see different types of characters. Some of these characters are wise and godly. Some are fools. And these different characters are teaching us all sorts of different lessons. And so we're going to look at 6 types of characters here in Proverbs 30, 10 through 33. Again, we're going to be covering lots of different things, not one focused application, but lots of different things. So I pray that the Lord would use whatever touches your heart this morning from these characters and lessons you can learn from them. So what are these character types in Proverbs 31 through 33, or 10 through 33? Well, the first type I call lowlifes. That's not a positive thing. These are people who are kind of at the, in terms of their moral and their wisdom, they're at the sort of bottom of the barrel, lowlifes. This is verses 10 through 14, and then also we'll look at verse 17. First of all, let me start with verse 10. Do not slander a servant to his master, lest he curse you and you be held guilty. In the ancient times, as you know, they had slavery. And one of the worst things you could do if you were a person not in slavery is to go up to a master of a slave and badmouth that slave. And here's why. You might think, why would you meddle? This displays not so much meddling, this displays actually oppression. Why? Because the slave can't say anything. He has no response. You've got all the power over him. So if you badmouth that slave to his master, that master can turn around and hurt that slave, but the slave can do nothing to defend himself against your slander. You're oppressing him if you do something like that. That's the point of the proverb. But here's what the proverb goes on to say. Do not slander a servant to his master, lest he curse you. All he can do is curse you. And here's the key, and you be held guilty. Now that's interesting. So here's somebody oppressing somebody else. But what this proverb says is, don't be so quick to do this sort of thing, because guess what? In God's sight, your oppression makes you guilty before the living God and liable to judgment. Oppression brings God's judgment. So one kind of lowlife is a person who really oppresses the weak and powerless. Another kind is verse 11. There are those who curse their fathers and do not bless their mothers. Now this reminds us of the law, where we're told in the Ten Commandments to honor our fathers and mothers. Well, this person is doing the exact opposite. Rather than blessing and honoring, he's cursing them. Well, again, that's a foolish way to behave, and it's the worst kind of lowlife. No gratitude, no honoring of his parents. He simply curses them. And then there's another kind of lowlife, verse 12. There are those who are clean in their own eyes, but are not washed of their filth. Here's a person who's so self-deluded. He thinks he's righteous. And in fact, he's morally filthy. Morally speaking, before the living God, he's wretched. But he thinks he's good. He thinks God's impressed. This is deluded self-righteousness. It's a form of folly. Ridiculous. Verse 13, here's another one. There are those, how lofty are their eyes, how high their eyelids lift. This is displaying an attitude of looking down on others. It's haughtiness. It's arrogance. You're dirt. I'm superior. This is another form of, ironically, not somebody high, but a lowlife. Somebody who thinks he's better than others. And God hates that. And here's another form, verse 14. There are those whose teeth are swords, whose fangs are knives, to devour the poor from off the earth, the needy from among mankind. This pictures this kind of person as a ravenous beast. And who's his prey? Again, the needy, the poor. This is a person who feeds off of and oppresses the poor for his own advantage. A fool, a lowlife. And then jump down to verse 17. Here's another one. The eye that mocks a father and scorns to obey a mother, and just stop there. This takes us back again to verse 14. This is suggesting a person who, again, looks down on his parents to bless them and scorn them. Here's what's going to happen to them. The eye that mocks a father and scorns to obey the mother, listen to this, this is gruesome, will be picked out by the ravens of the valley and eaten by the vultures. It pictures this person who, again, fails to honor his father and his mother and take care of them as a person who's going to die unburied and dishonored. He will get his due. So here we have just a quick vignettes of lowlifes. What do we learn from them? Let me suggest 3 lessons we can learn from these pictures here. First, these people teach us that God hates oppression. God hates it when we take advantage of others for our own benefit. He hates it. And again, as we saw here, it can take various forms. It can take the form of mistreating one's parents. It can take the form of taking advantage of others in order to enrich myself. It can take advantage. It can take the form of speaking against and striking against someone else who has no recourse. I remember a few years ago reading this story about a pastor who was at a restaurant, and rather than paying a tip, he wrote on the waitress's receipt, "I give God 10%. Why should I give you 18%? Yeah. So it gets worse. So she was kind of outraged about that, so she posted it, I don't know, on Facebook or something, and it kind of came out. And he found out that she posted it, and he was all outraged. So he called Applebee and had her fired. Now, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And this man's a pastor. But that's a form of oppression because she had really no recourse for his inappropriate behavior. God hates oppression. Second lesson we can learn. God hates arrogance. God hates it when I think I'm better than somebody else. He hates it. Because think of what I'm doing. I'm telling God, you know what? These image bearers who are image bearers like me, I'm better than them. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. Be very cautious about looking down on others or being arrogant, because that puts me on the side of the lowlifes, the fools who are under God's judgment. The only being that is superior to us is the living God who he worships. The rest of us are poor beggars coming to him for help. And third lesson we learned from these lowlifes, God hates self-righteousness. When I look around and I say, you know, I'm better than you in terms of my standing before God, what am I saying? I'm saying that somehow I've earned God's favor. No, I haven't. In God's sight, what? All have sinned and fall short, way, way, way short of the glory of God. So if I'm telling God, hey, you know what? I'm right with you. I've really impressed you. I'm telling God that I'm morally pure when I'm morally filthy. That's foolish. And that's deluded. And by the way, I was thinking about this. We need to be careful. Because sometimes we can be self-righteous when it comes to the self-righteous. In other words, we can be kind of like the Pharisee and the tax collector when the Pharisee says, Lord, I thank you that I'm not self-righteous like this self-righteous person. Well, then I'm becoming self-righteous at that point, aren't I? The gospel calls me to give up all pretense, fall at his feet and say, thank you for Jesus, and that I'm right with you because of him, not because of me. So these lowlifes, various types, teach us various lessons. But there's a second kind of character in Proverbs 30. These are what I call insatiables. Insatiables. Look at verse 15. First line. The leech has 2 daughters. Give and give. Leeches have these suckers on both ends. And that's really what it's referring to. They hold on to their host and they suck blood. The leech is never satisfied. He keeps gorging and gorging. That's the idea here. So he's suggesting, like leeches, these things I'm about to talk to you about are insatiable. They can't be satisfied. What are they? Look at verse 15b. 3 things are never satisfied, 4 never say enough. Let me just stop here for a minute. Before we actually look at this proverb, let me say a little bit about the form of the proverb. These proverbs are sometimes called numerical proverbs. They'll give you a number and then a number above that. For example, these 6 things the Lord hates, yes, 7 are an abomination to him. What's it saying? It's saying basically there are 7 things God really hates, and they all share something in common. That is, God hates them. Well, here we have a numerical proverb where basically it's saying these are 4 things that can't be satisfied. What are they? Sheol, the grave, can't be satisfied. The grave never says, okay, I've gotten billions of dead people here. We're done with it. No more death. No. Until Jesus defeats death, death never says enough. The barren womb. Think of this in the ancient world. It was the highest honor. One of the things that women wanted most of all was to have children. And if a woman couldn't have children, this was a tragedy. So there's something missing in the ancient world in a barren womb. That was the idea there. The land never satisfied with water. The land can never get enough water. You say, wait a minute. Have you been living in Chicagoland for the last 2 weeks? Rain after rain after rain. Oh, it's been awful. But let's say things happen where God said, okay, I'm not going to bring any more rain for Chicagoland for the next 2 months. You know what they'd be talking about in September? They'd be saying, we're going through a terrible drought. Why? Because the land never gets enough. We need more water. And then finally, fire. And the fire that never says enough. If the fire doesn't get more wood or fuel, it's going to go out. So it needs more and more and more and more. So all of these things are insatiables. Now here's the question. What is the point? Okay, I can look at all those things like a leech, fire, land, and so forth. I can look at these things, Sheol, and say, okay, those are never satisfied. What do we learn? What's the point of the proverb? Here's what I think the proverb is doing. I think the proverb is actually giving us an implicit warning about uncontrolled desire. About a desire that I have that is so strong, I won't allow it to be satisfied. Think, for example, extreme example, think of a person who's hooked on drugs, a heroin addict. That person can never get enough, always wants the next fix, and will do anything to do it. An unfulfilled, insatiable desire can be a problem. Why? Let me mention 2 reasons. First, actually 3. First, an insatiable, uncontrolled desire will often lead me directly into sin. I want it so bad, I'll do anything to get it. Second, an insatiable or an unfulfilled desire that's out of control will foster discontentment. We're told in Philippians that we're called, Philippians 4:11, we're called to be content with what God has given us. But if I have this uncontrolled desire, I'm never content. But here's the third problem. I think this is the big one. Paul tells us in Colossians 3:5 that covetousness is idolatry. You know what happens? If I have an uncontrolled desire that becomes so strong in my life, it virtually becomes the idol of my heart. It takes control. I want this more than anything else. It becomes my God. I pray for it. I seek it. It's all that matters to me. Now look, there are certain things that we can want a lot, and that's not wrong. But if it becomes uncontrolled, if it becomes greater than my passion for the living God, it is an idol. And that's a problem. And so I think the insatiables remind us that it's okay to have desires, but never that they're out of control and utterly insatiable. There's a third kind of character, type of character, in wisdom's gallery. We find this in verses 18 through 20. These are what I call wondrous mysteries. Wondrous mysteries. Look at verse 18. 3 things are too wonderful for me. 4 I do not understand. So there's a suggestion here of these are wonderful things that kind of blow my mind. They're mysteries. There are things about them that I don't understand, but they're beautiful in their own way. And what are they? Well, I want you to notice the first 3 of them. Verse 19, the way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of the ship on the high seas. Now, what in the world do they share in common? What makes them wonderful mysteries? Well, there's been a lot of discussion about this, but here's what I think's going on. All of these items, be it a ship or a snake or an eagle, when it comes to their environment, move freely, comfortably, appropriately, and in a sense beautifully in that environment, even though we might not understand exactly how. You watch an eagle in the sky, there's beauty there as he easily flies. And you wonder, how is he able to do that? Or a serpent, which has no legs or arms or anything, is nevertheless able to move very quickly on a rocky surface. Or a ship plowing through the ocean. There's a majesty and a beauty to that, even though I may not understand all the dynamics of that. And I think that's what that's getting at there. But in this numerical proverb, it's all really moving to the 4th one. A ship, a snake, a eagle, all of them talk about something moving and operating appropriately, even beautifully in its environment. And that leads us to the 4th thing that's like them. And what is it? The way of a man with a virgin. This talks about the marital relationship between a young man and a young woman as they come together in marriage, as they come together in sexual love in marriage. And there's a beauty because 2 become one flesh. Remember how Paul uses the analogy of marriage to picture the relationship between Christ and the church? And this is a profound mystery, he says. There's something wonderful and beautiful about marriage, about a man and a woman joining together as one flesh for the rest of their lives together. Now, having said that, verse 20 is kind of a shock. Kind of seems to come out of nowhere, but it actually fits very well. Look at verse 20. This is the way of an adulteress. Now let me just stop here. Okay? An adulteress. Agur is not just picking on women here. Okay? But remember, Proverbs is written as a father talking to his son. Okay? But you could just as easily put, this is the way of an adulterer. And men have done plenty, much more in terms of adultery, okay? So you could put either, right? But this is the way. Notice the picture here. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I've done no wrong. The adulteress or the adulterer treats sexual relations like eating. Yeah, I had a meal. It's good. Wipe my mouth. Okay, I'm done. Just lust, just fulfilling it. Yeah. And it's nothing wrong with this. That's the picture. Instead of the beauty and wonder and mystery of the marital union of a husband and wife in covenant, fidelity, you have a woman who's like, I engage in that. I fulfill my lust. It's no big deal. What's the big deal? It's like eating a meal. There's something gross and crass about that, isn't there? So what do we learn about from these wondrous mysteries? Let me suggest 2 lessons. First, do not forget that marriage is a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. Many of you have been married for a number of years. And we all know, if you've been married very long, marriage is hard, isn't it? It's just hard work because you have two people coming together who are selfish with selfish expectations. I want my wife to do all this stuff for me. I'm not so interested in me doing all this stuff for her, right? And yet, despite the struggle, despite the fact that you have two sinners, there's something wonderful and mysterious and beautiful about the idea that a husband and wife come together, join as two as one. So remember that. Remember that if you're married and you're in the battle with marriage, or in battle, or in conflict, or even in just the day-to-day struggles, remember, it's a beautiful thing that you're together. And if you're anticipating marriage, great, anticipate it. It's a beautiful thing. Here's a second lesson. Immorality is a gross distortion. It's like the adulteress here. And immorality runs rampant. It seems today in our cultural context that every form of sexual expectations, that sexual engagement outside of marriage is viewed positively. But within marriage, it's viewed as boring and a waste of time. And so that's the context we live in. And yet, all of that is a gross distortion. Now think of pornography, which is running rampant in our culture and in our churches. This is a gross distortion of the beauty of marriage. And so the wondrous mysteries teach us about the sanctity of marriage against gross immorality. So far we've seen three types of characters. We've seen lowlifes, insatiables, and wondrous mysteries. In verses 21 through 23, we come to a fourth type of character here in Proverbs 30. These are what I call the insufferables. The insufferables. Look at verse 21. Under three things the earth trembles. Under four it cannot bear up. Here you have this picture of an earthquake. I have never been in an earthquake, thank the Lord. Some of you may have. I can't imagine how frightening it is that everything, your whole ground, just shakes. But what's pictured here is a kind of social upheaval. A social upheaval that creates a kind of earthquake that just messes up the social order. Okay? And again, this is written in the context of the time. So what are certain things, what are certain kinds of people that become insufferable for various reasons, creating a kind of upheaval and havoc? First, a slave when he becomes king. Again, this is a world in which there was slavery. But think of what would happen if a slave became a king in the ancient world. Well, first of all, that would indicate that the whole social order has been destroyed, that a king could arise as a slave. But secondly, if a person has been a slave all his life, for reasons no fault of his own, he doesn't have the training to be in leadership. So he's promoted way above his abilities in light of what he's been. That creates havoc. The second kind of insufferable is also found in verse 22. A fool when he is filled with food. A fool who's prospering. That's the idea. In Proverbs, one kind of fool is the fool who goes into all sorts of schemes to try to make money and ends up in dire poverty because he's a fool. He's doing all things wrong. Okay, that ought to lead to not prosperity but despair if you're acting foolishly. But occasionally, a fool, despite his folly, may actually end up prospering. And what does that do? That just confirms in his mind, oh, my foolish ways are actually quite prosperous. Think of, for example, the person who's utterly addicted to gambling. He's always trying to make money quick, so he gambles. And lo and behold, he wins the lottery. What's he going to say? Well, boy, I'm glad. Look, my gambling was foolish, but at least I made some money. I'm done with gambling. No, he's going to say, Whoa, it worked. He's going to keep gambling. A fool who prospers, who's satisfied, will continue in his foolish ways, and that creates all kinds of havoc. Verse 23 is the third kind of insufferable. An unloved woman when she gets a husband. Now, that word unloved, that creates a kind of sympathy in our heart, doesn't it? And we can feel that. But I don't think that's quite the right translation, or at least the quite nuance. The word literally means a hated woman. A hated woman when she gets a husband. And the picture here, and again, it's, with Proverbs, it's often just a very brief glimpse. But what I think is going on here is you have a woman who is who's kind of just a sour person, just not likable at all, and treats people poorly, and yet she gets married. Because in the ancient world, if you were a woman, you didn't have a lot of career choices. Unfortunately, you needed to be married for survival. So here's a woman who's generally despised, and yet she gets a husband. And the image seems to be that her success here goes to her head. Now that she's got a husband, she's done what she needed to be, now she's even more insufferable. That seems to be what's going on there. And then there's a fourth kind of insufferable. A maidservant when she displaces her mistress. This is the idea of perhaps a slave woman in a home who is able to connive and get her way up and actually become the mistress of the house and displace the previous one, and exercises brutal authority in the home as a result. Now, so those are the pictures of what we would call insufferables who kind of create havoc with those around them. Notice then that we learn that there are several kinds of times that people become insufferable or situations become insufferable. First of all, situations become insufferable when people are promoted beyond their capabilities. So sometimes, if you're in leadership, sometimes you may say, well, I'm going to give somebody this position, and hopefully they'll do really well. And you're kind of hoping because you want to be on their team, and yet what happens is that they're just not ready for that position. And so it creates havoc with all those under them. I remember a number of years ago, my wife, when I was going to school, she worked in the business office at Trinity where I was going to school. And she was working for an office manager who then moved away, and they needed to replace her. So they asked my wife if she wanted to do it. She said, no, I don't want to. I like what I'm doing. I don't want the promotion. So shockingly, her boss then turned to one of her coworkers, my wife's coworkers, who was totally unprepared for the position, and offered it to her, and she took it. And it created havoc in the office. It was just a mess. It led to all sorts of bad things. And so we have to be careful when situations can become insufferable when people are promoted beyond their means. Secondly, people and situations can become insufferable when they're rewarded for inappropriate behavior, be that the fool who is satisfied and prospers, or the maidservant who manipulates to get into control. In both cases, the proverb here teaches us it creates insufferable situations because these people will continue to act in their foolish and deceptive ways and cause problems for others. And then the third lesson is people become insufferable when they let success go to their heads, like this hated woman. And you've probably have met people like that where something happened, they're given a promotion, and they go nuts. I can remember in college, there was one of my best friends, his roommate, was a really nice guy, and they, in the sort of the student government, they gave him a very high position. And when he got that position, it totally went to his head, and he just became nasty. That happens sometimes. So again, wisdom reminds us that if certain kinds of foolish behavior is promoted, it creates havoc for everyone else. There's a fifth type of character here in Proverbs 30. It's in verses 24 through 28. I call these little sages, little wise people. Notice verse 24. 4 things on earth are small, but they are exceedingly wise. What we're going to see here is an example of what we find in Proverbs a lot, that wisdom is better than strength. And so here we see 4 small, insignificant creatures, which tell us that wisdom is better than strength, because each of them give us an example, a facet of wisdom that we should take with us. So let's look at them. First, verse 25, the ants are a people not strong, yet they provide their food in the summer. So you know ants, relatively speaking, compared to us, they're not strong. You can crush them. And yet, they are amazing. They don't give up. I've had problems with ant hills in my yard. I can't even tell you how many times I've gone in and tried to, dig them out and everything, and they all run around. And I think maybe I'll even spray them with something. And I come back a few days later, and it's all built back up, and they're just going to town. What do ants tell us? What do they show us? They show us discipline, hard work, and planning. They keep working. They store their food so they can keep things going even in hard times. And they don't give up. They're hardworking, they're disciplined, they're planners. So we can learn from the ant wisdom in the sense of discipline and hard work. Second, the rock badgers are a people not mighty, yet they make their homes in the cliffs. Rock badgers were these small animals, not big, not powerful, small animals that were prey for lots of bigger creatures. But they had these sort of suckers on their hands or on their paws, and so they're able to climb high in the rock cliffs. And the reason they do this is to escape predators. Because if you don't have those sort of suckers on your paws, you're not going to get up there. So what do rock badgers teach us about wisdom? They teach us about making wise, prudent choices. It would be foolish for a rock badger to make a nice little den right by the river where the water's near, where they can get eaten. Now, that's just reckless. Wisdom would say, hey, you know what? Make a wise choice to keep yourself out of danger. They do that. Third kind of wise sage is in verse 27. The locusts have no king, yet all of them march in rank. Locusts don't have the locust king. There's no such thing. But together, they create an army. Indeed, the prophets compare powerful armies to locust plagues. You know what a locust plague is? A group of locusts will come in to farm area and wipe it clean. It's devastating. But locusts are just little small things you can crush. Yes, but together, marching together, working together, they can be devastatingly powerful. And so what do they teach us about wisdom? Well, the locusts teach us about the importance of unity and organization, working together, not having an I in team. It's folly for me to act as a lone ranger. It's just me. Can you imagine? You have a locust saying, I don't need these other locusts. I'm going to take care of that field, that field on my own. They'll get crushed. But working together in unity and organization is great power. And then finally, verse 28. The lizard, probably a gecko. The lizard, you can take in your hands. So they're so small, you can pick it up, take it in, even crush it if you want. Yet, it is in kings' palaces. These little geckos, these little lizards, they can crawl over everywhere. So they can be in kings' palaces. They can live there. And what do they suggest? Well, they suggest, I would recommend that the wisdom's characteristic of tenacity. They literally hang in there. They don't give up. They're tenacious. So whether it's hard work and discipline, whether it's wise choices, whether it's being unified, whether it's being tenacious, these wise, powerful little sages teach us about the characteristics of wisdom that make it better than even brute strength. Well, there's one other type of character we see here in Proverbs 30. It's what I call the confident and the overconfident. Look at verses 29 through 31. Here are the confident. 3 things are stately in their tread, 4 stately in their stride. This suggests that these things, just by the way they walk, their body language, suggest stately confidence. What are they? I mentioned them. The lion, which is mightiest among the beasts and does not turn back before any. The lion in the jungle is the top of the food chain. He has no predators. Who's going to threaten him? He's the king. He walks around in his jungle and everybody else flees because they don't want to be eaten. Confidence. The strutting rooster in the barnyard there in the coop, he's the king. He struts. The he-goat, again, in the barnyard, he's the top goat. Now, all of those are comparing to the last one, which is where he's getting. And a king whose army is with him. Think of a king with a powerful army. Now, there is a man of confidence. Why? He's in control of his army. What he says goes. Confidence. And all of that's appropriate. Whether a lion or a he-goat or a strutting rooster or a king with his army, they are confident, and they should be. But it can slip into overconfidence. Notice verse 32. If you have been foolish, exalting yourself, or if you have been devising evil. Let me just stop. Who's he talking about? He's talking about someone here who's so foolish, so arrogant, that he spends his time figuring out how he can exalt himself and devising perhaps evil schemes to make that happen. He's all about himself and making himself look great and prospering himself. This is a man who's self-consumed. So he says, if you're like that, put your hand on your mouth. Just shut up. Why? Verse 33. For pressing milk produces courage. Stir up milk, you get courage. Pressing the nose produces blood. Press the nose, wrench the nose, stir it up, you're going to get blood. And pressing anger, stirring up anger, produces strife. Yeah, you're all about yourself and making yourself look great because you're so confident about how great you are, and you scheme to make that happen. Guess what it says? You're just going to stir up anger, and then you'll be smacked down. You'll be lucky if you end up with a bloody nose. So there are times it's appropriate to be confident, but don't be overconfident like this fool. So let me just suggest 2 lessons briefly from the confident and the overconfident. Number 1, there is an appropriate time for legitimate confidence. If God has put you in a place of leadership, folks, be confident in that place of leadership. We sometimes think, perhaps as Christians, that, I'm a leader, I should be, timid, humble. No, when a king's leading his army, you know what? That king needs to be confident. Can you imagine a king leading his army? It's like, guys, is it okay if we go here? Could you imagine having a general like that? Hey, do you troops mind if we march over there? I know it's going to be like a few miles. Is that okay with you? Well, these guys would be like freaking out. They want a general. They want a king. And if God puts you in leadership, be confident. God has put you there. Do a good job. But never be overconfident in the sense that it's all about you. Self-promotion. is arrogant and deserves to be smacked down. And God will do that. So, there's wisdom's gallery. We've seen 6 types of people teaching us all kinds of lessons. We've seen lowlifes. We've seen inscrutables, or insatiables, I should say. We've seen in wonderful mysteries. We've seen insufferables. We've seen little sages. And we've seen the confident and overconfident. Now, I hope this morning that as we've looked at these different pictures, that perhaps somewhere in there, some of you have said, you know, I have been falling astray in terms of wisdom, being foolish in some of these areas. And perhaps God is directing your heart in a certain way to say, you know, I need to grow in wisdom in this particular area. But here's what I want to leave you with. Yes, grow in wisdom in whatever way we've talked about this morning. But don't forget last week's lesson. Growing in wisdom is never about you doing it. It's always about God doing it in you. So if you look at yourself and say, yes, you know, I haven't been confident like I should be, or I've let uncontrolled desires take control, or whatever the Lord has showed you this morning, ask God to help you grow in wisdom. Trust in Him to do that. You can't do it on your own, but He can do it in you by the power of His Spirit through Jesus Christ. Folks, that's the gospel. Let the gospel make you wise. And so I pray that the Lord would indeed grant us to grow in wisdom as we consider these various types of figures in wisdom's gallery. Let's pray.